Frank is 71, and he would tell you his mornings are healthy. He's up before 6, he makes coffee, he steps out onto the porch for a cigarette while it's still quiet. Back inside, he eats a quick breakfast, usually sausage on a biscuit because it's fast and he likes it. Then he laces up his shoes and heads out, straight up the steep part of his route. He's always believed that starting hard is the honest way to exercise. Get the worst over with. Nothing about that routine feels dangerous to him. Parts of it feel actively healthy, and some of it genuinely is. But here's what Frank doesn't know about the 90 minutes he just lived through. When you wake up, your heart does not simply continue doing what it was doing during sleep. Heart rate, blood pressure, hormones, movement, and demand all begin shifting together over a fairly short window. That is completely normal. It is supposed to happen. Your body is transitioning from its lowest demand period into a much more active one. The morning is not dangerous. I want to say that clearly before anything else, because plenty of videos would rather frighten you. But that transition is already asking something of your cardiovascular system, and 4 extremely common habits can push that transition harder than it needs to go. Frank is doing 3 of them before he's finished his first mile. So let's look at what's actually happening when you wake up, and then at each of the 4. Because once you see the pattern, the fixes are far less dramatic than you'd expect. Start with what your body is doing overnight, because it explains everything that follows. During sleep, your heart rate is generally lower. Your blood pressure typically drops as well. Your body is running on reduced demand. Less movement, less digestion, less thinking, and less work for the heart to support. Then waking begins, and a coordinated set of changes starts. The sympathetic nervous system, the part that prepares your body for action, becomes more active. You stand up, which itself requires an immediate blood pressure adjustment so you don't get lightheaded. You start moving, you get dressed, you go down the stairs, you make breakfast, and your blood pressure and heart rate climb toward their daytime range. Think of a house overnight. Almost everything is off. The system is idling on minimum power. Then morning comes, and the lights go on. The heating kicks in. The kettle, the toaster, the shower, the TV. People start moving between rooms and opening doors. The electrical system isn't failing. Nothing is broken. Demand is simply rising on schedule, exactly the way it's designed to. So here's the honest question this video is actually asking. Given that demand is already climbing on its own, what else are you choosing to switch on at the same time? Now I want to be careful with one thing, because this is where health content usually overreaches. Cardiovascular events have historically been observed more often during morning hours. That observation is real. But researchers have looked specifically at whether the size of someone's morning blood pressure rise predicts future events. The results across studies have been mixed rather than conclusive. So I'm not going to tell you your morning blood pressure surge is going to cause a heart attack. The evidence doesn't support that claim. What's more defensible is narrower and more useful. Morning is a period of cardiovascular transition. For people who already carry risk, an exaggerated rise may matter more. And the habits stacked on top of that transition are things you can actually do something about. That's the whole framework for this video. Not fear of the clock. Attention to what you add to it. So here are the 4. Briefly, before we take them one at a time. The first is something millions of people inhale within minutes of opening their eyes. The second is something active. Health-conscious people do specifically because they believe it's good for them. The third is hidden inside a completely ordinary breakfast, and almost nobody sees it. And the fourth is something most Americans would never think of as a drug at all. Let's start with Frank on the porch. The first habit is using nicotine soon after waking. A cigarette, a cigar, or a nicotine product. And I'm not going to lecture him, because that's useless, and he's heard it all before. What's worth understanding is the mechanism, and specifically why the timing interacts with what we just discussed. Nicotine acutely increases sympathetic activity. That's the same system that's already ramping up simply because you woke up. It can raise heart rate, and it can raise blood pressure. Both of those happen within minutes. Over the long term, smoking damages blood vessels and is one of the major contributors to atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease. That second part matters more than the first, and I'll come back to it. But picture the accelerator pedal for a moment. Waking up is already pressing that pedal gently. That's normal. That's the body getting ready for the day. Nicotine presses a second pedal at the same moment, in the same direction. Neither pedal on its own is the story. It's that they're both being pressed during a window when demand is already rising. Now here's the part I need to get right, and where most videos on this subject go wrong. The cigarette is not dangerous because a clock says 7 a.m. Smoking is harmful at 9 in the morning, at 2 in the afternoon, and at 11 at night. If you take one thing from this section, it should not be "I'll move my first cigarette to 10 o'clock." That change would accomplish very little. It reorganizes the harm without reducing it. The overwhelming majority of the cardiovascular benefit comes from reducing exposure and from quitting if you can. And I'm not going to pretend that's simple. Nicotine dependence is genuinely difficult, and people who quit usually make several attempts first. That's not a character failure, that's the normal pattern of how quitting actually works. If you want to work on it, your doctor or pharmacist can discuss the options available to you. There are more of them now than there used to be. I'm deliberately not going to recommend specific medications here, because those decisions depend on your health history and what else you take. What I will say is that the benefits of stopping begin fairly quickly, and they continue accruing for years afterward. There is one genuinely useful thing about the morning cigarette, though, and it isn't about your heart directly. How soon after waking someone reaches for the first cigarette is one of the clearest signals of how strong the dependence has become. Someone who smokes within 5 minutes of opening their eyes is in a different situation from someone whose first one comes at noon. That isn't a judgment, it's information, and it's the kind of information that helps a doctor choose an approach that actually fits you. So if you're going to notice one thing about your morning smoking, notice the timing, then bring that to someone who can help. So the practical version of habit 1 is not about the morning at all, it's about the total exposure. The morning framing simply helps you notice the habit exists, because things we do automatically become invisible. If you like understanding why ordinary habits affect the body, instead of just being told they're bad, subscribing is worth it. That's exactly what this channel does. Now let's move to the second habit, and this one is going to surprise you. Because the second habit is something healthy people do on purpose, believing it's the right approach. It's exercise, and I need to be extremely clear immediately before anyone misunderstands this section. Exercise is not the problem. Physical activity is one of the most valuable things you can do for your cardiovascular system at any age. Nothing in this video should ever be used as a reason to move less. That would be the exact wrong lesson. The problem is not exercise. The problem is going from nearly zero to very hard effort with nothing in between. Watch Frank again. He finishes his coffee, sits for another 10 minutes, puts on his shoes, and walks out the door. And within 90 seconds he's attacking the steepest part of the hill, because that's how he's always done it. Or picture someone who wakes up, sees fresh snow, and immediately starts shoveling the driveway. Or someone who steps outside and starts hauling bags of mulch across the yard before they've even fully woken up. Snow shoveling deserves a particular mention, because it combines several demanding things at once. It's heavy work. It's often done in cold air. It involves lifting and twisting, and people frequently rush it because they're late for something. And it typically happens first thing in the morning, with no warm-up whatsoever. In each case, the body goes from resting to substantial effort, with no intermediate step. So what actually happens during a warm-up, and why does it matter? A gradual warm-up lets several things rise together, rather than abruptly. Your heart rate increases progressively instead of jumping. Your breathing adjusts. Circulation to working muscles increases. Muscle temperature rises, which affects how muscles and joints perform. Your blood vessels have time to accommodate the change in demand, rather than being asked all at once. The American Heart Association's guidance on physical activity supports exactly this, gradually raising your heart rate before more intense activity. Think about a car sitting in a parking space. You don't put it in gear and floor the accelerator. You roll forward. You let the engine come up to speed. Then you drive normally. Nobody thinks of that as being cautious. It's just how you operate a machine sensibly. And there's a reason this matters more in the morning than at other times of day. After several hours lying still, your muscles and joints are cooler and stiffer than they'll be by afternoon. You've also just made a series of blood pressure adjustments simply by standing up and starting to move. So morning is the point in the day when your body has the least recent experience of being asked to work, which makes it the worst possible moment to skip the ramp. And, conveniently, the easiest moment to add one. So the practical replacement is genuinely simple, and it costs you about 5 minutes. Start with easy movement. Walk slowly on the flat part of the route before you reach any hill. Move your joints, shoulders, hips, ankles. Let your body understand that work is coming. Then increase your pace gradually. Then do the harder part of your session. If you're shoveling snow, start slowly with smaller loads before you settle into a rhythm. If you're doing heavy yard work, spend the first few minutes on the lighter tasks. And I want to be careful not to overcorrect here either. Plenty of adults over 60 tolerate vigorous exercise extremely well. And I'm not suggesting that vigorous activity is off the table after a certain birthday. The point is progression matched to your individual capacity, not avoidance. If you've been given specific activity guidance by your doctor, especially after a cardiac event or procedure, follow it. That guidance takes priority over anything general I say here. And one boundary that's worth stating plainly: new chest pressure or chest pain during exertion is not something to push through. Neither is unusual or severe breathlessness, fainting or lightheadedness that isn't normal for you. Those symptoms need medical attention, not determination. Working through it is the wrong instinct there. That's not a reason to fear exercise. It's the difference between listening to your body and overriding it. Now, the third habit, and this one is hiding inside something completely ordinary. Let's go back to Frank's breakfast. Sausage on a biscuit, with a slice of cheese and a little sauce. It's a normal American breakfast. Millions of people eat some version of it. There's nothing shocking about it. And I'm not going to tell you that one breakfast sandwich is going to hurt your heart, because that would be nonsense. The actual problem is accumulation. And it works through repetition rather than through any single meal. Here's the mechanism, and it's well established. Repeated high sodium intake makes blood pressure control harder for many people and contributes to hypertension over time. Hypertension sustained over years is one of the most significant contributors to cardiovascular disease and stroke. So the pathway here is slow: sodium pattern to blood pressure burden to cardiovascular risk over years. That's a completely different mechanism from the cigarette, which acts within minutes. Keep that distinction in mind. Now here's the part almost nobody realizes, and it's the reason this habit is so easy to miss. Most people don't get most of their sodium from the salt shaker. Frank didn't salt anything at that table. He'd tell you honestly that he doesn't add much salt to his food, and he'd be telling the truth. The large majority of sodium in the American diet comes from packaged, processed, and restaurant foods before it ever reaches your kitchen. So the salt shaker gets blamed while the actual sources sit quietly on the plate. Look at Frank's breakfast again, one component at a time. The processed breakfast meat carries sodium. The biscuit or roll carries sodium. The cheese carries sodium. The sauce carries sodium. Not one of them looks alarming on its own. Nobody would point at any single item and call it extreme. But 4 moderately salty things eaten together add up to something quite different from any one of them. That's the stack. And the reason it's invisible is that the addition happens across items rather than within any one of them. Then the same pattern repeats at lunch, and again at dinner most days of the week. So what's the practical response? It isn't banning breakfast, and it isn't memorizing milligram counts. The useful shift is to think about the total meal, instead of interrogating one ingredient. If one part of your breakfast is genuinely salty and you enjoy it, the rest doesn't also need to be processed and salty. Keep the sausage, but pair it with eggs and fruit rather than with cheese, a packaged biscuit and sauce. Or keep the sandwich, but make more mornings something simpler: oatmeal, yogurt, eggs, fruit, plain toast. You don't have to eliminate anything. You're reducing the number of high-sodium items that stack in a single meal. Here's a comparison that makes the stack concrete. 2 breakfasts, both have a sausage patty, because we're not taking that away. The first adds a packaged biscuit, a slice of processed cheese, and a spoonful of sauce. The second adds 2 scrambled eggs, a slice of plain toast, and half an orange. Same starting point, same amount of food on the plate, same amount of time to prepare. But the second breakfast has removed 3 separate sodium sources without removing the thing Frank actually wanted. That's the entire strategy in one image. You're not eating less, you're stacking less. And if you do look at labels, one habit is more useful than any other. Compare similar products against each other. 2 brands of the same food can differ substantially, and swapping between them requires no willpower at all. That's the kind of change that survives because it doesn't depend on you being disciplined every morning. One more note, because it matters for some viewers. If you have heart failure, kidney disease, or you've been given a specific sodium target by your doctor, follow that guidance rather than general advice. And now the fourth habit, where I'm going to tell you something you probably aren't expecting. Coffee is not the villain of this video. I know that's the opposite of what the internet has been telling you for years. So let me explain what actually changed. In July of 2026, the American Heart Association published a scientific statement in Circulation reviewing the evidence on caffeine and cardiovascular disease. Its conclusion was considerably more reassuring than previous conventional wisdom. For most healthy adults, intake of up to about 400 milligrams of caffeine per day is considered safe. That's roughly 3 to 5 8-ounce cups of brewed coffee, and it was not associated with increased cardiovascular risk. Beyond that, moderate coffee consumption was associated with lower risk of several conditions, including coronary heart disease, stroke, heart failure, and atrial fibrillation. So if you're 71 and you've been quietly feeling guilty about your 2 cups every morning, the current evidence does not support that guilt. A few honest caveats, because I'd rather give you the whole picture than the flattering half of it. Most of that research examined coffee, not purified caffeine, and coffee contains many biologically active compounds besides caffeine. Much of the evidence is observational, which shows association rather than proving that coffee itself causes the benefit. Unfiltered coffee, French press for instance, can raise LDL cholesterol, which is a separate consideration, and the statement noted that caffeine wasn't included in the AHA's dietary guidance because there isn't yet enough rigorous evidence to set formal intake recommendations. So, reassuring, genuinely, but not a prescription to start drinking more. One more practical note before we move on. Adding sugar, flavored syrups, and heavy cream changes what you're drinking, and none of that reassurance extends to those additions. A large sweetened coffee drink is a different item from a cup of black coffee, whatever the menu calls it, which means the actual habit we should be discussing is not your cup of coffee. It's what I'd call the stimulant stack. Several large caffeinated drinks in rapid succession. Energy drinks, concentrated energy shots, pre-workout powders, caffeine pills. And often several of these combined, because each one individually feels normal. The same AHA statement was much more cautious here. Data on high-dose caffeine, particularly from energy drinks, is limited, and what exists generally suggests cardiovascular harm rather than benefit. That's a meaningfully different conclusion from the one about coffee, drawn by the same group of experts reviewing the evidence at the same time. So here's the mechanism. Briefly, caffeine blocks adenosine, a molecule that promotes drowsiness, which is why it makes you feel more alert. It can also increase sympathetic activity and temporarily raise blood pressure. But people vary enormously in how they respond. Genetics affect how quickly you metabolize caffeine. Regular drinkers develop partial tolerance to some effects, so the same dose does different things to different people. And that variation is exactly why a blanket recommendation for everyone would be dishonest. There's one more nuance worth knowing, because it shows how complicated this really is. Randomized trial data among regular coffee drinkers found that caffeinated coffee decreased the occurrence of atrial fibrillation, but it increased the frequency of premature ventricular contractions, which are extra heartbeats. So even within one beverage, the effects on the heart aren't uniform in one direction. Anyone giving you a simple verdict on caffeine is compressing something that genuinely isn't simple. The practical takeaway isn't quit coffee, it's know what you're actually consuming. A cup of coffee and a concentrated energy product are not interchangeable just because both contain caffeine. The dose can differ by several times, and the surrounding ingredients differ too. And there are people for whom this deserves a real conversation with their doctor. If you have difficult to control high blood pressure, palpitations, a known arrhythmia, or you're on medications that interact with caffeine, your situation isn't the general case. The AHA statement specifically noted potential harm from high doses among people with severe hypertension or heightened caffeine sensitivity. That's a conversation to have with your clinician, who knows your history, not a decision to make from a video. So let's put all 4 of these on one board, because the way they fit together is the actual point. It would be easy and dishonest to say all 4 spike your heart in the same way. They don't. Nicotine adds acute sympathetic stimulation, an immediate effect on top of long-term vascular damage. Going from rest straight to hard effort adds an abrupt workload with no ramp. The high-sodium breakfast pattern adds long-term blood pressure burden, built through repetition over years. And stimulant stacking can add temporary cardiovascular stimulation, mainly mattering for people who are sensitive or already at risk. 4 different pathways on 4 different timescales, and 4 different degrees of certainty in the evidence behind them. What they share is this: each one adds cardiovascular load or risk that you didn't have to take on. And each one tends to be invisible precisely because it's routine. And there's a useful consequence of them being different, which is worth saying out loud. You don't have to fix all 4. They aren't a package deal, and they don't have equal weight for every person. If you smoke, that one dwarfs the other 3. Start there and don't spread your effort thin. If you don't smoke and your blood pressure is well controlled, the warm-up and the sodium pattern are where your attention belongs. And if you drink 1 or 2 cups of coffee, that item may simply not apply to you at all. Pick the one that's actually yours. A single change you keep beats 4 changes you abandon in 3 weeks. Your heart doesn't know that something is part of your morning. It only knows the demand you place on it. So let's rebuild Frank's morning. And I'm not going to give him a miraculous transformation, because that's not how anyone actually changes. He wakes up and takes a few minutes to become properly awake before doing anything demanding. His coffee stays. It was never the problem, and giving it up wouldn't have helped him. He's working on the cigarettes, with his doctor's help, and he's had 2 false starts already. That's normal, and he's continuing anyway. That single change will matter more to his heart than everything else in this video combined. His breakfast still includes food he actually likes, but on most mornings it's not 4 processed items stacked together. And when he walks, he spends the first 5 minutes on the flat stretch before he takes on the hill. The hill is still there and he still climbs it. He just doesn't ask his body to go from the armchair to a steep grade in 90 seconds. That's the whole redesign, nothing dramatic. Nothing he'll have abandoned by March. One final thing, and it's important. If you take prescribed cardiovascular medication for blood pressure, cholesterol, rhythm, anything, one rule matters most. Do not change the dose or the timing based on this video. Medication timing is individualized, and there are real reasons a clinician may have chosen the schedule you're on. That conversation belongs with the person who prescribed it. And if you ever experience chest pressure or pain, severe unexplained shortness of breath, fainting or sudden weakness or trouble speaking, that's not a lifestyle question. That's emergency care. So here's where this all lands. Heart health after 60 is rarely protected by one miracle food, one supplement, or one secret exercise. Much more often, it's protected by removing unnecessary strain from the things you repeat every single day without thinking. And it's protected by the unglamorous work, knowing your blood pressure numbers, taking prescribed medication as directed, keeping the appointments. Your morning already asks your cardiovascular system to wake up alongside you. That part is normal and healthy. You simply don't need to make that transition harder than it has to be. A better morning isn't about treating your heart as though it's fragile. It's about giving it fewer unnecessary battles before the day has even properly begun.